From the remote Cassiar Mountains of northern British Columbia, a magnificent book is born, one that speaks of the universal and transcendent theme of peace. It is carved, not printed. It contains only 3 sentences. There's only one copy, yet millions may read it. This book is made out of jade, the toughest naturally occurring material on Earth. The enduring stone that Canada's Coast Salish found in the Fraser and Bridge rivers and used 3,000 years ago, and that Chinese have revered as the stone of heaven for up to 5,000 years. It will last for many millennia. It will travel, be carried through space and time, speak to future generations. Born out of faith, it is the Jade Book, a stone of hope.
The idea to carve a book out of jade came to me in 1999 while I was working on my first sculpture in jade, a portrait bust of my wife Katerina. I had already fallen in love with the material and the challenge of carving it, and I was inspired and I saw the possibility of doing something even more challenging. Later, while carving the bust, I came up with the idea to carve a book completely out of jade with bound pages that could be turned. I had a pretty good idea that this had never been done before, and I was thrilled at the thought of trying something that seemed almost impossible to do.
It can be a struggle at times to find the right words to describe to others what the Jade Book is exactly. The pages of the book were not made separately and then attached. Instead, they were freed from the 2 jade arches that continue to bind them so that they could be turned. The arches actually extend up from and are a part of the last page of the book. This is what makes the sculpture so complex and unique, the only one of its kind in history.
Carving the Jade Book was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. It took 2 years of working up to 12 hours a day, including weekends. Nephrite, the type of jade I use, it's very difficult to carve because it's the toughest stone, the stone with the most resistance to breaking. In fact, steel cannot scratch it. The steel tools that are used to work with jade have to be diamond coated in order for them to cut the stone. I started with a block of BC jade that I bought from Jadeway Enterprises. They mine in the Cassiar segment, and this particular piece came from one of their sites called the Super Bowl, just east of this lake, the town known as the jade capital of the world. Once I had the right piece of nephrite, as free of fractures as I could find, I asked Dean Briscoe Princess Jade to cut the rough form of the book for me and partially cut each page up to where the arches will be. I then transferred the measurements from the drawings I made onto the jade and started drilling into the stone to begin forming the arches of the book. That was the hardest part. Each hole had to be drilled parallel to the one beside it, and because some of the drill bits that I used were so long and thin, there was a chance that will bend as they cut into the stone. I had to hold the drill very steady, and once I started drilling a hole, I couldn't stop and I couldn't make any sudden movements. Even a sneeze could have jeopardized the project. There was always the risk also that the drill would overheat and jam, so the water that I used to keep it cool had to be consistent. I had to custom make a saw that would fit between the two arches along the spine. With the saw's diamond edge blade, I made 3 cuts to match up with those that the Brisky had made. Then I used a handheld power saw to cut the pages inside each arch. And finally, I cleaned around the partial formed arches with diamond mounted points to a depth of about 4 centimeters so that I could free the first page. I was so thrilled the moment I heard the first page click and felt it give way, because at that moment I knew with certainty that I could free the others. Next, I drilled the jade to varying depths, chipped off the coarse ground and shaped the faces. I cut around the letters first and then drilled, chipped and ground the jade in the spaces surrounding them. The letters were very difficult to carve. Finally, in August of 2002, I spent 3 weeks sanding the entire sculpture 7 times and then spent 10 days polishing it using diamond paste on a leather cloth. In total, I ended up drilling about 13,000 holes to create the entire sculpture, and I used many different tools.
When all of the pages were freed, my father had to make a final decision about what to carve on them. He said that he'd thought of carving unknown people from varying ethnic backgrounds onto the bound pages to express the concept of oneness. He knew that this sculpture could last for thousands of years, so he felt almost obligated to carve something that would be meaningful to everyone. In the end, he decided to carve the faces of great humanitarians whose lives and legacies were truly inspiring. The 3 that he ultimately picked and linked together in his book, Mother Teresa, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Mahatma Gandhi, happen to represent different genders, ages, nationalities, and religions. It wasn't until I started doing some research for my book that I discovered the connections between these humanitarians, and the incredible connection also between nephrite and the theme of human potential for improvement, the theme of peace. I discovered things that my father didn't know about, things that he hadn't taken into account when he had chosen the material, form, and theme of his sculpture. He knew that Gandhi had liberated approximately 350 million Indians from British rule in 1947 without using violence. He knew that Mother Teresa and the order she founded and directed, the Missionaries of Charity, served the poorest of the poor in Calcutta, India, by living like them and among them. And he knew that Martin Luther King Jr. was the champion of the civil rights movement, that he fought to put an end to segregation of African Americans in the United States, and that he was instrumental in the passing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. He also knew that Mother Teresa and Martin Luther King Jr. had both won the Nobel Peace Prize, and that Gandhi had been nominated for this prize in the year that he was assassinated. But he was not fully aware of how these 3 humanitarians were interconnected. Mother Teresa stepped out onto the streets of Calcutta, India, to work with the poorest of the poor in 1948, the same year that Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated. It was as if she were meant to take his place in continuing to serve and draw attention to India's homeless and hungry. While Indians, like others around the world, referred to this nun who served them as Mother, they had called Gandhi, who came before her, Bapu, meaning father. Indians gave both Gandhi and Mother Teresa the name Mahatma, meaning great soul. and they loved and revered Mother Teresa so much that when she passed away, her body was carried in the same gun carriage during her funeral procession as the body of Mahatma Gandhi. Martin Luther King Jr. was profoundly influenced by Gandhi's teachings on non-cooperation and non-violent social change. He even traveled to India in 1959 to learn more about the Gandhian philosophy of non-violence. Like Mahatma Gandhi, he was imprisoned several times for opposing unjust laws. And like his mentor, who was assassinated in 1948, Dr. King was also assassinated in 1968. Dr. King combined Christ's teachings about love with Gandhi's about non-cooperation and non-violent resistance, and the latter provided him with a way to put love into action to serve many African Americans who experience discrimination. Mother Teresa also spoke both of Christ's teachings and Gandhi's method of nonviolence, as both gave her direction and made it possible for her to do the very difficult things that she had to do daily. Dr. King was Baptist, and Mother Teresa was Catholic. Both were devout Christians, but like Gandhi, who was born into the Hindu faith, they believed in the right of each individual to have the freedom to practice his or her own faith. They also shared the belief in the interconnectedness and the immense worth of every individual. As I did my research, I was amazed to discover that, without knowing it, my father had chosen to carve a peace book out of the same stone to which China's ancient philosopher and politician Confucius attributed such qualities as virtue, loyalty, intelligence, justice, humanity, and truth. These were the same qualities that Mother Teresa, Dr. King, and Mahatma Gandhi strove to embody. Confucius even believed that fractures in nephrite were symbolic of sincerity. My father had done his best to find a block of nephrite that was as free of fractures as possible. But given that he needed such a large piece, it was not possible to avoid them. Once he cut into the stone and sculpted the images and words, he was able to see any fractures that did exist. He could have chosen to conceal them with wax, but he decided not to. He made this decision without knowing of Confucius's belief. Sincerity was a quality that these humanitarians certainly possessed. They were open about their faults, and they strove to correct themselves, to improve their behavior. They sought truth and perfection, feeling that such a pursuit brought them closer to God, the God they believed that we all shared despite his numerous titles. My father had chosen jade strictly for its physical characteristics. He didn't even have the theme of peace in mind at the very start. Nephrite and the attributes that could bring peace to humanity had been linked for hundreds of years. That he chose the material that would be most fitting for this sculpture in every way was an extraordinary coincidence. As he worked, I would often share what I had learned with him, and as he worked, it seemed as if the Jade Book had a will of its own, as if it were deciding how it would take shape. It evolved into something more beautiful and symbolic than he had planned or could have ever imagined. He could not take credit for the things that he didn't know, and he certainly couldn't take credit for what he discovered about the sculpture once it had already been made. Structuring the book as he did resulted in two very meaningful outcomes. He had intentionally designed the pages so that they would be shorter in width towards the middle, between the two arches. He needed this extra space so that the saw he made could cut down far enough to match up with the cuts that Dean had made to separate each page. It turned out that these spaces would function as windows when the book stood upright, something he had not intended. Windows that would reveal the face or faces of those on previous pages. A second thing that he did not foresee was that light would pass through the jade in the space surrounding the carved images of Mother Teresa, Dr. King, and Gandhi, where the pages were thinner. He knew jade was translucent, but he did not originally intend for the book to be displayed standing with its pages spread open, so he hadn't even thought about light coming through. When he stood the book up for the first time and saw the light pass through the pages, he was surprised and a little alarmed, as if he had unintentionally ruined the project. But a few seconds later, he felt otherwise. The block of nephrite that my father started with came from the toughest of mountains, and it was literally transformed, hewed into a stone of hope. The making of the Jade Book represents the way in which Mother Teresa, Dr. King, and Mahatma Gandhi were able to take despair and mold it into hope. It honors the way in which these three humanitarians successfully climbed the highest and most insurmountable of mountains, the mountain of prejudice, intolerance, fear, hatred, violence, greed, and indifference. The Jade Book serves as a reminder that hope comes in many different forms, and that each person is capable of finding or hewing his or her own stone of hope and discovering peace in the most difficult of circumstances and in the most impossible of ways. The Jade Book conveys the message that as sure as people are able to transform nephrite, it is also possible for them to be transformed, or for them to transform themselves into more compassionate and charitable individuals.
For the front cover of the book, I decided to carve a piece of breaking free of the bars that once imprisoned her. Her imprisonment symbolized the ongoing struggle for international peace, and her escape reflects the belief that peace is possible.